All right, we're back with part 2 of our lesson 12 on Capernaum. All right, our topics for lesson 12, this part 2 will be Jesus retreating after a night of healings. We'll have Jesus clarifying his itinerant ministry model to his disciples, which I think might catch them a little off guard at this point. And then we'll talk about the first miraculous catch that happened at Tabgha. You may or may not be aware there is actually a second miraculous catch that will happen in the exact same location a few years later, and we can read about that in John 21. That will be one of the last lessons that we cover in this course, but just sit tight. If you want to read ahead, you can read John 21 and find out what happens. We'll always start with Acts 17:11. I'll shorten it up a little bit because I think you get the idea, but the bottom line is the Bereans received the word with all eagerness, and they examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So we need to be like the Bereans, not accept anything at face value, but always make sure we're checking it out against scripture. We'll be comparing these scriptures. So these are all about the first tour of Galilee. So we have Matthew 4:23 through 25, Mark 1:35 through 39, and then all will read Luke 4:42 through 44. You might want to pause the video and read the Matthew and Mark passages for comparison. So we'll start with Luke 4:42. And when it was day, he departed and went to a desolate place. And the people sought him and came to him and would have kept him from leaving. But he said to them, I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns as well, for I was sent for this purpose. And he was preaching in the synagogues of Judea. Now, it's interesting that these three passages are relatively similar, but Luke notes that he went back down to Judea. Mark notes that he preached throughout Galilee. And then Matthew notes his fame spread throughout Syria. So he was all around that region. And then in verse 25, Matthew talks about Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and even east of the Jordan in today what is modern day Jordan. So are these three contradictory? No, well, probably not. We can probably safely assume that Jesus preached in all of these areas. So it's just a reminder that just because the Gospels don't all include exactly the same thing, they are complementary, they're not contradictory. So it notes that early in the morning, Jesus went up and went out to a desolate place. This could be where the confusion of the previous mention of Jesus withdrawing to Galilee comes from. So there were indeed times where Jesus retreated in order to be alone. But the previous verse we've already talked about, where it says he withdrew to Galilee, that doesn't mean he went to a desolate place. However, here in Mark 1 and Luke 4:42, it does say that he went to a desolate place. We can assume that the people needed healing probably stayed in Peter's house until early in the morning, so perhaps Jesus only got a few hours sleep and then slipped out of the house before everyone awoke and went to a quiet place to pray. Simon was one of those who searched for him. So notice Peter's always taking a leadership role, and that can have strengths and weaknesses, but as we will see as we go through the Gospels. But notice it's always Peter who tends to be out in front. Sometimes he gets out in front of Jesus, which is not good, but when he's out in front leading the other disciples, that's usually a good thing. This is a bronze statue of Peter at Capernaum. It was dedicated by Pope John Paul II way back in March 2000, and so it has the tradition of Peter holding the keys to the kingdom, and then his the St. Peter's fish is there at his feet too. Luke records he was preaching in the synagogues of Judea. Matthew records that he went to Syria, and Mark records that he went throughout Galilee. At any case, Jesus made it clear his ministry would not remain in one place. And I can imagine maybe Peter and the others, I don't know, I wonder how they reacted. I should ask that. So did they kind of wish he would set up shop in Capernaum, that way I could keep the fishing business going, and on Saturdays, hear this great teacher. On Saturday nights, I get a front row seat to all these, miraculous healings. So at this stage, is it fair to ask whether the disciples truly understood the cost of being a disciple? Leaving with Jesus was not without significant financial risk, and I think that same is true today, depending on where and what he is calling us to. So again, we're following Luke's chronology. The disciples, although I'm calling them that, they haven't been officially called to full-time ministry yet. That will actually happen in the next verse in Luke. It's also interesting that it doesn't report that the disciples went with him. Maybe they did, but maybe they didn't. It appears the crowds definitely went with him because they wanted the miracle and they wanted the show. So I guess an application question is, which group would we be in? Which group would I be in? Would I be the one kind of bummed that, he's asking me to leave town even though I'm comfortable? Or would I be one wanting a show, or would I be really seeking to follow in discipleship and in my for my master? This picture is of a synagogue in Jericho. It's built in 75 BC, making it one of the oldest synagogues that they've discovered in Israel. The complex includes a small courtyard here, and then this is probably where the mikveh is. And so when we think of baptism, it has its roots in the Jewish mikveh, and mikveh is just a pool of fresh water where they would go in, and periodically it'd be ceremonially cleansed, just as our baptism today symbolizes our new life. So it's all related. The synagogue and everything else in Herod's winter palace in Jericho was destroyed in 31 BC by an earthquake. Okay, now we get to Luke 5, and you can see some of the Matthew and Mark passages are a little bit out of order. But again, following Luke's chronology, chapter 5, on one occasion while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, or we know that as the Sea of Galilee. He saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. This is not the first time he does this, by the way. There's actually where he talks about the parable of the sower. There's actually a cove that they've identified is probably the location where he gave that message. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let your nets down for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when he had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats, so that both began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." And when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. So Matthew and Mark both record, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And then it says immediately they left their nets and followed him. So we've talked a little bit before about how if we follow Luke's chronology, it actually makes more sense with respect to Jewish discipleship, because it wasn't like they didn't know that they were about to get this offer letter, if you will. They knew what it entailed at that point. So for a lot of reasons, the Luke chronology makes sense. This is a picture of Tabqa, and it's the traditional location of the calling of the disciples. It's also the traditional location of John 21, where after Jesus' resurrection, he cooks the men a morning breakfast and says the exact same thing about the fish. So they toiled all night and didn't catch anything, and he says, "Drop your nets and you'll have a different outcome." He also restores Peter, and so there's this beach area here. It doesn't look like it in this picture, but my friend Dan Stolbarger calls this Restoration Beach because of what happened there. And that's when Jesus pulls Peter aside and says, "Do you love me?" 3 times in effect, and 1 time for each of his 3 denials. So that's a very meaningful place to visit. There are springs here, and it's that grow algae, and so the fish tend to congregate there. So it's become it's been known as a fisherman's spot for many thousands of years here. So he gets in the boat. He says, "Let's go out again." Remember, they're washing their nets, so they think their time is done and they're ready to call it a day. But then Jesus says, "No, our work's not done yet," literally and figuratively. And perhaps in the middle of giving the message, he tells them to put their nets down. So you can imagine Peter saying, he's a carpenter. What does this landlubber know about fishing? He should stick to teaching and healing and let us handle the fishing. So who knows if he thought that, but maybe that's what was going through his mind. We can speculate as to his reaction, which says, depart from me because I'm a sinful man. Now he and the other Talmudim who would now spend the rest of their lives coming to terms with who he really is. And by the way, so it is that way with us too. We make a moment decision to follow Jesus, and then the rest of our lives coming to terms with what exactly that means. This is the same area, but pictured from above. Many times I think the church interprets the Great Commission, which, as we may remember, says, go into all nations and make disciples. I think while we know it says disciples, a lot of times churches and mission groups act as if it actually says converts, as if it says go and make converts, because what tends to be the measuring stick, if I could call it that, of a successful missions trip is like the number of people who made decisions for Christ. I'm not downplaying that. That's very important. But it's also important to note that that's not what the Great Commission says. The Great Commission says to go and make disciples. And the Hebrew word for that I've latched onto, as one of the first Hebrew words I've learned, is Talmudim. And so that's disciples in the plural, and the singular would be Talmid. So being a Talmid in original context was a lifelong journey of following Jesus, not a one-time decision. There's a saying that a number of authors have latched onto, that the Jewish Talmudim were told to follow their master so closely that they become covered in his dust. And then several authors have picked up on that. Lois Feiberg, Ray Vanderlaan, and Dan Stolbarger, just to name a few, have written materials capturing this theme of sitting at the feet of Rabbi Jesus, walking in the dust of Rabbi Jesus. And by the way, they're not saying you need to become Jewish or adopt any kind of aspects of rabbinic Judaism. Those people I just mentioned are just routine, mainstream 21st century Christians, but realize, as I do, that there are things that we can learn and apply from this first century method of discipleship. So that's one of the reasons we're going line by line through the Gospels like this. The intent is to become better disciples and better Talmudim. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, the other thing I absolutely love about this site is that it's the traditional location of John 21. It is one of the few beaches that we can find along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, although as you can see from this picture, it's a pebbly, rocky beach, not one that you would run your toes through. That's not very comfortable. But you may recall the night of Jesus' arrest, Peter had his infamous 3 denials. He denied Christ 3 times. Tradition holds that he was so devastated about what he had done that John had to keep watch over him, as in Peter was on suicide watch. So who knows if that's true or not, but it definitely makes sense, right, what he had done. So a few days later, at this very beach, Jesus is risen, and there is another miraculous catch, almost the same circumstances. They were out all night, didn't catch anything. Jesus says, hey guys, drop your nets. And they have a great catch. And then they come in, they have breakfast. Then Jesus pulls Peter aside for a moment, and I try to imagine what might have been going through Peter's mind. Was it, just brokenness, or, oh boy, I'm really in for it now. What's going to happen? But instead, in true Jesus form, Jesus restores him, elevates him far above even where he was as a disciple, and he gives him a threefold restoration. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? So one for each of Peter's denials. Remember, Peter was the one, and we'll see in a few weeks in Caesarea Philippi, where Peter has this great declaration, you are the Messiah. So Peter knew, maybe more than any of the other disciples, who Jesus was. So it's interesting that in Luke 5, Peter says, leave me, I'm a sinful man. When you compare that a few years later at this exact spot, Peter will learn that it's because he's a sinful man that he needs to cling to Jesus and not push him away. And so obviously we need to do the same. So my friend Dan Stolbarger, who leads tours and who I've been privileged to go with to Israel twice, he calls this Restoration Beach, and I can think of no better name for that. We are on a discipleship path, and there will be times, many times in my case, where I mess things up. And we need to remember that of all of the things Jesus is, he is the great restorer too. When that happens, when I mess up in my mind, I travel to this beach and I imagine Jesus putting an arm around me, and pulling me aside and acknowledging, we're not denying what happened, but we're saying we're going to dust yourself off and we're going to do better. Dan also uses the phrase tikkun olam, and that's actually a Jewish thought, not necessarily religious, but it means fixing the broken things of the world. And there's no better example of that than Jesus. That's what Jesus came to do, is fix the broken things. So that's what he did to Peter on this very spot, and that's why I absolutely love this place. Outside of Jerusalem, Tagba is probably my favorite spot in Israel. So we all need to go there someday. When this COVID thing is all over, let's plan a trip. There's one more thing about the miraculous catch that struck me as I was going through this. And by the way, this picture was taken around 1900. And in our supplemental video on Capernaum, we'll look at fishing practices and the various nets used. And they even found a boat that was from the 1st century. They found that in the 1980s. I was reminded of the movie Facing the Giants, which a lot of us saw back several years ago. If you haven't seen it, it's about a football coach, high school, who's down on his luck, losing team. He's about to get fired. He decides that he's going to rededicate his life to Christ. And then the story says, he ended up winning the state championship 2 years in a row, and everything's great. In the middle of that movie, though, it really is a great movie. In the middle of that movie, there is, when the coach is really at a low point, there's this man named Mr. Bridges who prays over the students, and he's just a man who prays. And he walks up to the coach and tells him a story. And the story goes like this. I heard a story about 2 farmers who desperately needed rain. Both of them prayed for rain, but only one of them went out and prepared his fields to receive it. Which one do you think trusted God to send the rain? The coach answered that it was the one who prepared the fields, of course. Mr. Bridges then asked, which one are you? Meaning, which farmer are you? I think a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this too, when things are tight or rough or whatever, we pray for God and we ask God to remove it. Just wave the equivalent of a magic wand and take it away. But we need to be looking at how we can be preparing our fields for rain. And so it hit me that in Luke 5, in the first couple of verses, it says that they didn't catch anything, but yet they were still mending their nets. They still were preparing their business. And it hit me that if they hadn't have done that, if they hadn't have kept their nets up, if they hadn't kept their boats seaworthy, right? If they hadn't kept their physical strength up, that miraculous catch would never have happened. Jesus could have sent all the fish in the world, but if their nets, which were breaking as it was, but imagine if they weren't mended, they would have snapped right away, and then the fish would have left. And what if their boat sank? What if they weren't strong enough physically to haul the catch in? So, and I'm not saying that God helps those who helps themselves, because that's not scriptural, but there is a difference between that and I am making a deal with God. I'm going to do my part, so you better do yours, versus being the farmer in the story and preparing your fields for rain and expecting God to send the rain. So there's just a lesson there that I think we shouldn't miss. This is another early 1900s photograph. It shows just a great haul of fish. So in that day, Jesus was really good for business. The soon-to-be disciples learned that Jesus is not only master of the Torah, he's not only master of healing miracles, but he also controls nature as well. And in a sense, this echoes God providing manna and the quail in the wilderness, just miraculously controlling nature so that they fulfill his purposes. And then we'll foreshadow the multiplication of bread and fishes, as we also see in a few chapters. That's actually also near Tagba. Another picture of someone mending his nets. Keener in his commentary notes that men working from more than one boat could actually let down larger nets than those working from only one. So we'll talk about that in that Capernaum video. Fish could be emptied onto one boat and the nets hauled ashore. So having the business relationship that Simon and Andrew were in business with the family of Zebedee, very, very much very common. I thought this was interesting. It's ancient crochet, I guess, is mending the nets. This is actually a needle that they use for mending fishing nets. This picture probably isn't totally accurate because there were probably dozens of people who stuck around after the teaching and to see the great catch. But I often wonder what those people were thinking. So the Bible doesn't say this, but I don't think it's a stretch to think that the people on the shore probably ate pretty well that day. There's all that fish that was just there, and at least four people got some great fishing gear, right? So what, while the four disciples were called, they left their nets immediately. Um, I think there also could be a hint of something deeper where Jesus says, I'll make you fishers of men. So Moses and David were shepherds that became shepherds of their people. And so there might be a similarity that Peter and the others were fishermen who became fishers of men. I actually like how this net fragment looks a little like a fish, if you can imagine it. Um, if we follow Luke's chronology, as well as just knowing what we know about first century discipleship practices, we know that the disciples knew Jesus beforehand and therefore had the opportunity to count the cost before making this life-changing decision. So I like to think of it as they were prepared and waiting for the invitation, something like a bride who was waiting and waiting for a proposal, and then one day she gets her proposal and then immediately she accepts. So I think it's more like that, more than the fact that they were caught off guard and were under some spell or something like that that caused them to drop everything and follow him. Jesus later explains that the kingdom of heaven and the messianic age can be likened to a dragnet that will swoop everyone up. The good fish will be placed in containers, but the bad fish will be thrown away. So there's a little bit of a darker edge to this, all this net imagery as well. This is from an article called Rabbi and Talmudim by Ray Vanderlaan. He's one of the authors that I mentioned earlier. He's looked into the first century discipleship practices that Jesus' disciples would have been used to. He writes that Galileans were extremely religious and among the most religious Jews in the world at that time. They were very well educated in the Bible. In fact, in later years, centers of learning were all centered in Galilee. The great schools of Jewish thought were all in Galilee. So there's generally a three-stage process, and I'll compare it to elementary school, high school, and college. Those aren't exactly right, but you get the idea. You finish one and you move on to the next one if you're qualified. So the first one is called Bet Sefer, and that's House of the Scroll, and that's really started at ages 4 to 5 and continued on up until age 12. They would learn to read and write the Torah. They would begin to focus on memorization of the Torah and learn how to apply it basically, right? So you're talking with elementary school age children, and so you're speaking to them at that level. In fact, there's an anecdote that says that the first day of school, the rabbi who was teaching would come by and give each student a dollop of honey, and on his command, the students would lick the honey up, and then the rabbi would say, always remember that the words of Torah are as sweet as this honey you're tasting. So they'd always have that memory to go on. Then the next level up, around ages 12 or 13, would have been the Bet Midrash, which was for the gifted students, or basically those who made the cut from Bet Sefer got to move on to Bet Midrash. And this is where probably the age we see Jesus at the temple was probably when he was making this transition. It's a bit of an anachronism to say that was when his bar mitzvah was, because bar mitzvah actually came much later. But it possibly had its roots in this process where at age 12 or 13, you're kind of, as a boy, you're coming of age. And so if you're qualified, you would move on. And then Beit Talmud, which is 15 and up, would be probably where the disciples were when we're finding them. So they're probably in their mid to late teens, and this is where they're actually chosen by a rabbi. And they would have to prove themselves. So I'm sure during the Bet Midrash, they were being observed and evaluated, which is what Jesus was doing probably in the early chapters of Luke, if we follow Luke's chronology. And what a Talmud, so remember Talmud means disciple, listening, observing, following, imitating, and then we mentioned earlier walking in the dust of the rabbi. So you would follow so closely that you were to be covered in his dust. Being a Talmud means total commitment to your rabbi. There's a humorous story that one student even followed his rabbi into the commode to learn what he could learn there, and I won't go into it, but he learned a few things, things that you should do while you're in the commode. So anyway, it's that kind of commitment. And then finally, at age 30, the best of the best of the best would become a rabbi or a disciple maker himself. So right now, I would say we're a mixture of both, because we are Talmudim always. We're totally focused on Jesus or Yeshua, our rabbi. And what Vanderleen writes is we must passionately know God's word and Jesus' interpretation of it. But then also, once we reach a level of maturity, then we're also called to raise other disciples, which is where the Great Commission comes in. And then Vanderleen writes, we must strive for relationships with others so that they will observe us and seek to imitate our love, devotion, and our Jesus-like lifestyle. So it doesn't stop at being a Talmudid, although we're going to be a Talmudim, we're Talmud all the way the rest of our life. But at some point, we need to be on the lookout for those others of us who we can disciple. And that's what we're doing when we go through this series. We're trying to be better Talmudim. Okay, that wraps it up for this video. Again, there's I mentioned this previously. There's this Following the Messiah, episode 4. That's all about Capernaum and all about fishing, and I will have a link for it in the comments section. Our application questions. So think about what miraculous catches have I had in my life? Do I give God the credit, or do I give the fact that my nets were mended? So I think there's certainly a mixture of both. But conversely, are my nets, boats, and physical conditioning such that I'm prepared to receive a miracle? I think there's that aspect of it too we can't ignore. Would I allow Jesus to disrupt my life? So we talked early on about how Jesus he wasn't going to stay in Capernaum. He was going to move around, and maybe the disciples were a little bit disappointed in that. Maybe they weren't. Maybe I'm just saying that I would be disappointed if that were me. So then I have to ask myself, would I allow Jesus to disrupt my life? I mean, really disrupt my life. So think about that. How much have I grown as a Talmud disciple since becoming a convert? So we talked about the difference between the Great Commission. It doesn't necessarily mean make a convert, although that's the first step. We're called to make disciples. So are we stagnated since our conversion? Hopefully not. Or are we growing day by day? And studying the word is the best way to grow in our discipleship. And then lastly, think about, for whom in my life could I be a rabbi? Who can I disciple? Not in the way that I want that person to imitate everything I do, but I want that person to imitate Jesus, and I want to be able to point them to Jesus. All right, that wraps it up. Here are the references I used. Next lesson will be we'll continue in Luke 5, and we will look at new wineskins. So we'll see you on the next lesson.